now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Susan K. Woods, who is a Sister of Charity of Leavenworth, Kentucky. And if you've read her, I'm sorry? Oh, Kansas, what did I say? Kentucky, oh, okay. I hope that's not a foretaste of what is to come. Susan is currently Professor of Systematic Theology at Regis College in Catholic Brown School of Theology in Canada, one of the 3 Jesuit theologians in North America. From 2019 to 2022, Susan was the Academic Dean of Regis. And during that time, Susan was one of my bosses. She hired me to teach 2 courses in the Master of Arts in Ministry, and to also do some curriculum development for nascent priests and ministers to serve the church around the globe. Susan received her doctorate in systematic theology from Marquette University. Her writing has influenced leaders in the church, and Susan is also a consultant for the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops in the area of liturgy and sacraments. Susan is also highly regarded amongst Jesuits in Canada and the U.S. As you've read in Susan's biography, she is an accomplished author and leader of the church not only in North America, but around the globe. And while Susan has done many things to contribute to the church, theology, and the formation of young Jesuits and ministers for the future, all of these many accomplishments is not who she is. Susan is a vowed religious woman who has dedicated her life and gifts to the advancement of the mission of Jesus, of the mission of the church, of the mission of the Society of Jesus, and our mission as we serve in all of those. She is a stunning colleague among Jesuit theologians and superiors, conversant with the documents of the general congregations of the Society of Jesus and their primitive documents going back to the first Jesuit fathers. Blending all of these together, Susan is, in my estimation, an Ignatian mystic, that is, a woman of deep prayer and reflection, whose relationship with God is profound and energizing. She is a woman very, very aware of the presence of God in the here and now. Yet above and beyond all of these, Susan is a cherished friend who has inspired my theological and ministerial vision in a uniquely Ignatian way. That is why I invited her to our gathering today. And so I give to you my sister, my colleague, my friend, Susan Wood.
Thank you so much. This is the first time Damien and I have seen each other in person. Our friendship is entirely Zoom. What our relationship has been up to this time. So it shows you what the power of Zoom is. I'm going to give you a little more of my background, which has something to do with today, and that was a fabulous introduction. My teaching career started out as a high school teacher, so I've been where you are. I taught for 6 years at Hayden High School in Topeka, Kansas, where I taught French, English, and then religion before moving into college teaching. I taught with Benedictines in Collegeville, Minnesota for 13 years before moving to Marquette, where I was there 14 years and now have been at Regis for 4 years. So 18 years with Jesuits, 13 years with Benedictines. I'm a Sister of Charity. That's 3 different charisms. And I joke, how many can you absorb in one lifetime? The reason I say this is that I'm standing before you today as a non-Jesuit, that's obvious, talking about things Jesuit. And when I was at St. John's in Collegeville, I spent a lot of time wondering, what am I doing here as a Sister of Charity of Leavenworth, who's an apostolic religious, that means active, not monastic, in a monastic environment, when I arrived at St. John's, there were all these men walking around in habits. I had never been in a choir stall in my entire life before that time. And I took to it like a duck to water. And I had the opportunity to address the community on a number of occasions. And I say this because when we, who are not members of a sponsoring religious community, work in an institution of that community, we take on the responsibility for furthering their mission and their charism. And the reality is, and I can speak of this both in terms of my knowledge of the faculty at Marquette, which was Jesuit, and at St. John's, which was Benedictine, is that lay faculty are often take a job because it's a job, they need a job, it's a terrific school with a good reputation. And so you sign on to a job, but not necessarily a mission, and the mission comes later as you get to know the institution. And I'm familiar with the lay faculty at these institutions saying, once they learn the charism of the community, which for Benedictines was hospitality, recognize Christ and the visitor who comes. And so the lay people took on that charism with enthusiasm, but they weren't always so sure about the Catholic part of things, because many of them were not. And unfortunately, many people approach their knowledge of the Catholic Church through its moral teachings, which they may disagree with, and so they say, I don't know, I don't want that, without realizing the total richness of things. And the same thing was true at Marquette. They liked Jesuit, they weren't so sure about the Catholic piece of it, and that was just part of it. Today, we're going to be talking about mission. On 3 levels. This morning, for the first presentation, I'm going to be talking about the broadest mission in terms of the Catholic Church. The second presentation will be on the mission of a Jesuit school, and then this afternoon, I'll talk about what is the role of an educational leader in terms of what we've just said. And I just realized you need to tell me how much time I have, because I don't have the schedule in front of me.
Well, we're going to do ish time.
Okay, ish time. I'm not only calendar challenged, I'm talk challenged. So what I realized early on, that is when we start talking about mission, I received some feedback that, well, maybe you should get rid of that word because mission, at least in the Canadian context, is associated with residential schools and religious communities and the government coming in and destroying culture and indigenous language. And so somebody said, well, you shouldn't be talking about mission. And the president of Regis was telling me about this feedback because he'd gotten it, and it didn't come directly to me, that's how criticism comes. And I said, I can't do that. We can't erase mission from our language, but we have to know where we've been with this language. And so we have a legacy of a paradigm of conquest related to mission. And in the 16th and 19th centuries, Spain and Portugal were given the responsibility for the evangelization of the people they encountered. And so they went to North America, and there was a creation of new churches, but indigenous peoples were purged of their cultural heritage. But there were important voices, even while this was going on, that challenged that paradigm. For example, Bartholomew de las Casas was a Dominican in Latin America who challenged it. And in Latin America, there were what were called Jesuit reductions, which were communities of indigenous peoples placed under Jesuit protection against the slave trade. We all know Matteo Ricci, who went to China and introduced Chinese rites, kind of a liturgy that was acculturated to the Chinese culture. He was condemned for this at the time, but later exonerated. And Roberto de Nobili, another Jesuit, who introduced a method of adaptation in India. So even though there were conquests of peoples, there were important prophetic voices pushing back on this. At this time, there was a quantitative expansion by creation of new churches in mission territories. And so mission was related to Catholicity, which is, the spread of Catholicism. So we have the spread of church to other lands and to communicate the scriptures into languages and cultures of various peoples. And we saw that from the earliest times of the church when an original Hebrew cultural context was translated into Hellenist, Coptic, Armenian, Persian, Syrian, Indian, Slavic, Chinese, etc., etc. And interestingly enough, only after 1400 did Europe become the Christian heartland of things. So that's one context of mission. But we're going to look at mission from a different context. So in this first unit, we're going to talk about the church's universal mission. And what I have here is probably what you received as, the propaganda for today from Damien. That a Jesuit school is a Catholic school and so participates in the universal Catholic mission. In other words, you can't take Catholic out of Jesuit any more than you can take Catholic out of Benedictine. And so anyway, my marching orders were that in this first unit, we would have an increased familiarity with pertinent church documents that define and direct the apostolic mission of the church today. If she's giving me 25 minutes, you're going to get this much, with the whole thing. And a deeper understanding of the laity's role by virtue of their baptism. But I want to start with what was mission like in the earliest church. Forget this, 15th, 16th, 17th centuries. Let's go back to the gospel. And in Matthew 28, we have this missionary commandment, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Now, notice, I think there's a shift, because in the gospel, the emphasis is on disciple, whereas in this missionary expansion under the Portuguese and the Spanish, it was the expansion of the church, not disciples, and that's an important difference. And in the commandments that are listed, that are referenced here, are the commandments in the gospel, which include the Sermon on the Mount and the moral teachings in the gospel. And the moral teaching in the gospel, the greatest commandment is love of God and love of neighbor. So, we shouldn't narrow this down too quickly. And the mission is to proclaim the good news of Jesus Christ. So in Mark, we have go into the whole world, proclaim the gospel to every creature. And the gospel, of course, is translated good news. And then in the shorter ending of Mark, we have afterwards Jesus himself, through them, sent forth from east to west the sacred imperishable proclamation of eternal salvation. So it's the good news of Jesus Christ, which is really the kerygma. And in the Acts of the Apostles, the kerygma is a short statement belief that Jesus Christ came, he suffered, he died, he rose for our salvation. That's the charisma, and that's what's proclaimed. And it's the good news of Jesus Christ that is the focus of mission. And so the idea is that those who encounter Jesus are witnesses of that encounter. And that is what is spread to the ends of the earth, is the witness. Not institutional spread, but personal witness. So when Pope Francis writes, he contrasts an evangelizing church from a worldly church. The evangelizing church goes out from itself, it hears the word of God, and then proclaims it, which is the first line in Dei Verbum, which is the dogmatic constitution on divine revelation. And it's a decentralized church because Christ, not the church, is the center of that proclamation. Now, I'm an ecclesiologist, and I'm a sacramental theologian, and I'm an ecumenist. So all those, for all of those, the church is very important to me. But it's important to know what the church is for, that it's not, it's institutional growth, which is emphasized, but the message of Christ. And then authority in the church is exercised like a shepherd caring for sheep. Then the worldly church lives within itself, of itself, for itself. There's self-referentiality, and it's a kind of theological narcissism if we're only looking at the church. And what's valued in a worldly church is that you have a small group of people who are the moral or the intellectual elite who sometimes use moralism as a weapon for people that they disagree with. And so Francis says, let's be perpetually in a state of mission. And as it's a truism that the church doesn't have a mission, it is a mission because it is sent, and the mission is the transformation of the world into the reign of God. The mission gets expressed in different ways. I particularly like the expression of the church's mission in Luke 4:18-21, which, just to recall the context for this, Jesus is baptized, and at his baptism, the heavens open, and there's a voice that says, "Behold, my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The Spirit is in the form of a dove over Jesus as he's baptized. So we have that Trinitarian icon of his baptism. Then the Gospel of Mark says the Spirit drove him into the desert. He didn't wander into the desert. He didn't take a trip to the desert. He was driven into the desert. Where he went temptation. I really think he came to his self-knowledge of his mission in that desert experience. Because what happens after the desert is then he goes back to his hometown, picks up the scriptures in the synagogue, and reads from the text of Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring glad tidings to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to captives, recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and proclaim a year acceptable to the Lord. That's a statement of mission. And the rest of the gospel, he lives that out. And we see his healing of the sick. We see him forgiving sins. We see him setting people free. And literally, sight to the blind. So the gospel then is an unfolding of this mission, which I think he came to this knowledge of this in the desert experience through the Spirit. I've been on this little bit of a personal journey since last June, so it's almost a year now. I was asked to give a presentation to the Jesuits of Canada for their Congress, and the woman who invited me said, "Susan, would you speak about the future of the church?" And I said, "I don't have a crystal ball. I can't tell you what the future is. But I'll talk about Pope Francis." And so in almost a year now, I've been immersed into this business of Francis, and I've come up with the conviction that to understand Pope Francis and what he's doing with mission, you have to conceive of it in what I call 4 pillars. The first one is pre-evangelization, and it's a personal encounter with Christ, personal conversion. Because the center pillar, even though 4 doesn't go to a center very easily, is proclamation of the gospel of mercy. And before we can proclaim, or before we can witness, we have to have this personal experience first. And then, only after this proclamation of mercy can you start talking about doctrine. It's kind of like the RCIA, the Rite of Christian Initiation for Adults, where in the early churches this was conceived. The new people initiated into the church first experienced the sacraments of the church, and only after they experienced them were they explained to them in the period of mystagogia. And so, which is a fancy name, sounds like a sneeze, but it's the after Easter, there's supposed to be a kind of a continued instruction, which is what that refers to. And so you can't talk about doctrine until people have first met Christ, is basically what the message is. And the last piece of this is structural reform of the church. And we have Francis doing a number of things. He revised the dicasteries in Rome. Those are the official offices. The head office used to be the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. It's now the dicastery for evangelization is the most important one. So anyway, these 4 pillars. I don't have time to talk about all of this today, but I am going to talk about this first moment of conversion, and the second one, which is mercy, proclamation of mercy. Francis said, "Pray and proclaim the gospel" in Evangelium Gaudium, which is his apostolic exhortation of the joy of the gospel. And as a theologian, I kind of stumbled over this because I'm used to hear the gospel and then proclaim it, instead of pray and proclaim it. And so I wondered what this pray was all about. And in this document, he says, "I invite all Christians everywhere at this very moment to a renewed personal encounter with Jesus Christ, or at least an openness to letting him encounter them." And I ask all of this to do this unfailingly each day. And so, and he also said, prayer is the primary job of the apostle. The second is to proclaim the gospel, which means that we have to experience this. We have to have this encounter with Christ before we can begin to proclaim Christ. And so in this line then, when we are still asking ourselves, what is the mission of the church? The mission of the church is to witness to Jesus Christ and proclaim his saving mercy. So it's not to plant churches. It's not, there was a time when people had clickers at communion and they'd click how many people came to the communion. Because then the parishes would have to report this to the bishop. That's a quantitative assessment of mission. How many people did you baptize? How many people, are in your communion lines? We should be way beyond that. It should be, how have you witnessed in your life? And so in John 1, we have this, because it says, we declare to you what was from the beginning, what we have heard, what we have seen with our eyes, what we have looked at and touched with our hands concerning the word of life. This life was revealed, and we have seen it and testified to it, and declared to you the eternal life that was with the Father and was revealed to us. We declare to you what we have seen and heard, so that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son, Jesus Christ. So it's this witness. Okay, I've taught high school students, I've taught undergraduate students, I've taught graduate students, I teach seminarians, and I would say the biggest challenge in teaching undergraduate students is that so many of them were bored with Christianity. They were much more interested in studying Buddhism or some other interreligious faith because they thought they knew it all in terms of Christianity. Now, as teachers, you know they don't. But why are we bored with Christianity? And it's common. It's really common. And I think it's because we've lost that initial experience, that initial spark that inflamed the first disciples and the first apostles in terms of their eyewitness. And I think what Pope Francis is trying to do is to get people in touch with that foundational experience, to ignite them anew, to spread that. And so he says in The Joy of the Gospel, I dream of a missionary option that is a missionary impulse capable of transforming everything, so that the church's customs, way of doing things, times and schedules, language and structures can be suitably challenged for the evangelization of today's world rather than for self-preservation. I was on the leadership team for the Catholic Theological Society of America, and while I was doing that, we had yearly dinners with the Doctrine Committee of the USCCB. And so I was at one of these dinners one day, and Cardinal Wuerl was presiding at the dinner, and I was sitting next to Bishop McManus. And I said to Bishop McManus, and Cardinal Wuerl overheard me, I don't know what's new about the new evangelization, is what I was saying. Well, Cardinal Wuerl kind of took me on with that and then launched forward. Because frankly, at that point in my life, you know, any word that ends in ION is such an abstraction, you don't know what it really means. And I had no idea what evangelization was until Pope Francis came along, and I learned. And so he's got another wonderful document called Rejoice and Be Glad on the Call to Holiness in Today's World. And he says, are there moments when you place yourselves quietly in the Lord's presence, when you calmly spend time with him, when you bask in his gaze? Do you let his fire inflame your heart? Unless you let him warm you more and more with his love and tenderness, you will not catch fire. How will you then be able to set the hearts of others on fire by your world or witness? Again, I don't have time to go into this, but I've become very sensitized to the word gaze in Pope Francis's writings. I did a word search in Evangelii Gaudium, which only shows you what a word is. And it's mentioned 10 times in the different say. And I was reading the constitutions for the General Congregation of the Jesuits in 36, and the word gaze is there. Once you get sensitized to it, you see it everywhere. So I would invite you to notice it when you see it. In a famous interview with Spadaro, who was a journalist, the Spadaro asked Pope Francis, he says, who is ordained Bergoglio? That's Pope Francis's name before he took his pope name. And the answer was, I am a sinner on whom the Lord has cast his gaze. And he said, this is not a figure of speech, it's the truth. And there are a number of, if you, again, this is a very thing to do, if you Google Pope Francis and gaze, you will find a number of homilies that he's given on different scenes in the gospel where the Lord looks on, it's the call of Matthew, it's the call of Zacchaeus, and it's this gaze, which is this encounter. And gaze is a really interesting word in English because it means looking at something for a while, you know, and noticing. It's not just looking, it's not just seeing, but it's that encounter. And so the proclamation of the Kerygma, which is the proclamation that is the mission of the church, is that the most important thing is the first proclamation. Jesus Christ has saved you, and the ministers of the church must be ministers of mercy above all. In pastoral ministry, we accompany people and we heal their wounds. In the next section, I'm going to talk about the importance of wounds in terms of Jesuit mission. Oh, I guess I'm going to do that here. So and can I do this?
Yeah, 1 minute.
I'm on 17 and 19. But this one has a lot, I have a lot to say about this picture. Okay, the Good Samaritan. You all know the story, right? The guys at the side of the ditch, and the priest and the Levi, and these people passing by, and the Samaritan, who's the persona non grata, stops and cares for the guy, takes him to it, and cares for his wounds. Okay, for Francis is called this parable pure gospel. In other words, if you want to synthesize the whole gospel message into one parable, one picture, this is it. And so this is the message. Now, wounds. Enormously important. I'm supposed to be talking about the Jesuit sources, so let me talk a little bit about the spiritual exercises. There is a meditation in the spiritual exercises that belongs to the 4th week in terms of the resurrection. And you all know the story that doubting Thomas comes along and doesn't want to believe that it's Jesus, and he says, ask me to, put your hand in my side. And so Thomas puts his hands into the wounds of Christ, recognizes Jesus for who he is, and says, my Lord and my God, proclamation of faith. For a long time, I thought that the meaning of this passage was that he recognized that there's a continuity between the resurrected Christ and the Christ crucified. Okay, this is the same guy. It's not an impersonation. It's not a hallucination, but it's really good. And I learned by seeing what Francis is doing with wounds, it's much deeper than that. Because when he confesses belief in Christ, it's not only, yeah, you're the person who died for us. And that still seems really distant. But he recognizes that it is the wounded Christ who saves us, and it's wound on wound. And so that we are wounded people, and as wounded people, we minister. Now, Henry Nouwen, I haven't read book. I'm always talking about titles of books. Anyway, he has a book called The Wounded Healer. Some of you may have read it, which is the same notion of this. But I also, there's another dimension to this. And so one of the tricks for how to read a parable is that we're every person in that scene. We are the Good Samaritan who has to pick up the wounded people, and that's kind of how we usually read it. But we're also the guy in the ditch, the people who are wounded, who require the ministry of others. And my latest interpretation of this from the Canadian Jesuits is that it's not only individuals who are in the ditch, but the church is in the ditch. The church is wounded. And so I'm on a little team for the Jesuits in Canada, putting together a retreat booklet for the end of July. And at their Congress last summer, I talked about Francis, and then they had a meeting just with the Jesuits, not with their collaborators, the next day. And their emphasis was, what does it mean to minister in a humiliated and wounded church? And our church is wounded and humiliated because of our history. One is the sex abuse scandal has humiliated us and wounded us. In Canada, there's a lively sense of, I'm an American, but I keep talking about Canada, of what happened in the residential schools and the discovery of these unmarked graves. The same thing happened here in the United States. I don't think it quite gets the same amount of press as up there. But, and so how do we, as Catholics, as school leaders, and the Jesuits are asking themselves as a community, how do we serve how do we approach our ministry as representatives of this humiliated and wounded church? And it's a really important question, but the answer is, it's only through our wounds that we can heal other wounds and be sensitized to them. And so Francis says, only if we experience this healing power firsthand in our own wounds, as individual persons and as a body, will we lose the fear of letting ourselves be moved by the immensity of our brothers and sisters' suffering. So being wounded ourselves gives us compassion to deal with others. And so as any of you who are familiar with Francis at all would know that one of his favorite images of the church is that of a field hospital. And what the church needs today is the thing the church needs most today is the ability to heal wounds and to warm the hearts of the faithful. It needs nearness, proximity. I see the church as a field hospital after battle. So this is a different way of looking at the church, and I think it's Francis's gift for us. And I know I'm out of time, so I better stop. So thank you. You're welcome. Wow, that's a lot. Thank you, Susan. Okay, so we have a little schedule glitch here, and here's my proposed remedy. And from now till 9:40, Susan is going to give us 2 or 3 questions to ponder. And we'll do that, you don't have to sit here. You can walk around outside. The cafeteria is still open if you want to get some coffee, some scones, some yogurt. But I'm going to ask you to please keep quiet in the house so people can reflect on these questions. Let's come back at 9:45, and we will spend only 15 minutes in spiritual conversations, and I will lead that. All right? Susan, do you have these questions for us? I can just tell you that. 3 points. Striking point, sticking point, relevant point. The
The sticking point is, what do you disagree with? What do you need more information about? What doesn't sit well with you? That's why it sticks. And the third point is the relevant point, which is, what difference does this make for your ministry as a Catholic school leader? Got those? Striking point, sticking point, relevant point.
Of charity in a Benedictine environment, and wondering what I was doing there as an apostolic religious in a monastic environment. I went through this question for about 3 years, and then the person who helped me answer it was a Benedictine sister from Atchison, Kansas, who was teaching at St. John's at the time. She's an Old Testament teacher. And she told me that religious communities privilege certain biblical texts in their self-identity. And one of the differences between a monastic environment and an apostolic environment is that the monastic tradition privileges wisdom literature, like Psalms, Sirach, wisdom. And apostolic religious tend toward the Gospels. For example, my Vincentian community is very fond of Matthew 25. Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. I was on the Illumination and Text Committee for the St. John's Bible, and it really helps to be an outsider sometimes when you're with another community, because you notice things they take for granted. And I said, you have to illustrate in the St. John's Bible this text from Sirach, of something about by running streams, send out your fragrance like blossoms. And they looked at me like I was crazy. And I said, well, you pray this text every morning prayer for the Feast of St. Benedict. And they said, we do. They hadn't ever noticed that. And so I'm on this continuing Ignatian journey right now. And what I've discovered is I think the cross is a heavy Ignatian text. So that would be kind of one example of that. So when we look at the mission, so when we narrow down from, the Catholic Church is a big church, to the mission of the Society of Jesus, one of the things we'll want to pay attention to are the texts for that society. The other thing I wanted to say about mission is when you are not a member of a religious community working for that community's institution, is that we as, I hate to say employee, that sounds so cold but and contractual, but we who are part of that family, of that apostolic work, have the responsibility ourselves of absorbing and propagating that mission. When I worked with Benedictines, because they were a big community at that time, and I went there in 1992, and their monastic life is kind of organized around a place rather than a work. They were pretty self-sufficient and had to deliver the message that you have to share that mission with your collaborators, otherwise it's not going to spread. The apostolic work that realized this early on was really the healthcare systems, because mission and identity got going in healthcare much earlier than it did in education. And I think Jesuits are really good about realizing that they have collaborators in mission, so that this mission of the Society of Jesus I'm going to be talking about is something that those of us who are part of this larger Ignatian family, even if it's by employment, need to share. Okay, again, our working, our marching orders for this unit was a working familiarity with pertinent and seminal documents of the Society of Jesus that define and direct their apostolic work. That's huge, Damien. I'm not going to do all of it. I'm going to concentrate on GC 36, which was the documents coming out of the 36th General Congregation of the Society, and trying to relate some of that to the spiritual exercises. And then, which relates to the second goal of a clear understanding of values and vision of the spiritual exercises that ground and animate that mission. And I'll do that largely through the lens of Pope Francis. Okay, so this was my thought, actually, in the middle of the night last night. On the train, so this week I've been reading GC 36, and I was reading Pope Francis's address to GC 36. And then I went back and was reading about mission in GC 32, which was the General Congregation that happened it happened within the pontificate of John Paul II. And it struck me that, and I put this as a question mark because I'm not an expert in this at this point, but it seemed to me that I was seeing a trajectory. And that if you look at the formula of the Institute, which would be its founding formula, the mission was stated as a defense and propagation of the faith and progress of souls in life and doctrine. Now you realize this is centuries ago, so it's kind of archaic language to our ears. But, defense and propagation of the faith. Again, note that the Jesuit community and movement, was post-Reformational, and so defending the faith largely in the face of Protestants. And if you read the Thinking with the Church, which is the rules for thinking with the church are in the back of the spiritual exercises, some of them sound very post-Reformation in tone. And so that probably doesn't resonate with us very strongly today in our language or outlook. And then in GC 32, which is quite a jump from the formula of the Institute, I realize this, but I'm a systematic theologian, not a historian. The language is service of faith and promotion of justice. And, it was around this time that the bishops had a synod where they said doing justice is constitutive of faith, that you can't separate faith and justice. So there's a lot of emphasis on justice. And from even the founding documents of the Society of Jesus through GC 32 and up through 36 is a lot of emphasis on service to the poor would be part of that justice dimension. But then, when I was reading the documents for GC 36, it echoes quite strongly the language of Pope Francis. Now, Pope Francis's Evangelii Gaudium came out in 2013. I was asking Damien exactly what was the year of GC 36. I think it was around 2019. Do the Jesuits here know that? 17. Okay, thank you. But at any rate, it's post Pope Francis Evangelii Gaudium, and so it echoes. What's really interesting is that these again, I am not an expert on this, so I stand for it to be corrected, but both reading GC 32 and reading GC 36, it strikes me that the language of the Constitution strongly reflects the papacy of the time, the theology of the church, which makes sense. And so we have the proclamation of the tender mercy of God, which is purely Francis language in GC 36. Now, as I look at this trajectory, I see development in Jesuit articulation of mission, that we have faith mentioned, defense and propagation of the faith in the formula of the Institute, the service of faith in GC 32. And faith can sound kind of abstract. And, I can go into a kind of a theological explanation that your theology of faith is correlated with your theology of revelation. So there was a time when we associated faith as faith in propositional statements of truth or doctrine, and that paralleled a notion of revelation as propositional, which came out of Vatican I, and that after Vatican II, and particularly with the Catechism of the Catholic Church, we have Vatican II in Dei Verbum, the dogmatic constitution on the faith, articulating the fullness of revelation as being Jesus Christ. And then faith is adherence and trust and relationship with Jesus Christ, not with a statement. So it's a much more personalistic sense. I once did a study of Dei Verbum and found out there's only one paragraph in the whole document that talks about faith. What really develops the concept of faith for Catholicism is the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which uses Abraham and Mary as types of faith. And there you get the personalistic response in faith most obviously. So, the concept of faith can be unpacked, but when we get to GC 36 and this articulation of mission in terms of proclamation of the tender mercy of God, it's related to the kerygma, which I gave you in the last section, which is, Jesus Christ has saved us from our sins and is for us in this tender mercy. That's the proclamation, which is the content of faith. The kerygma is the content of faith. And then look at the development from the concept of justice to the concept of mercy. Justice we can talk about what is due to a person by reason of their dignity as human beings, what's owed to them, or just we can talk about distributive justice. But mercy goes much further than justice. And it's regardless of what someone earns or what someone deserves, mercy is given. And so I think this is a significant development, as I look at the trajectory. So the first decree of the General Congregation 36 is our companions in a mission of reconciliation and justice. So we're returning to justice language, but what is coming forth in this decree very strongly is the notion of reconciliation. And so faith, justice, and solidarity with the poor and the excluded are central elements of the mission of reconciliation. This is not new in GC 36 because justice, is strongly in the Jesuit tradition, and even more strongly is the notion of accompanying the poor. And it also says, we experience joy in knowing ourselves as sinners who in God's mercy are called to be companions of Jesus and co-workers with God. Okay, Francis' language through and through in terms of his notion of joy as being part of this mission. And remember what I told you, that when Spadaro asked Pope Francis, who is Jorge Bergoglio? He says, I am a sinner on whom the Lord has cast his gaze. And so this knowing ourselves as sinners is also articulated as part of this Jesuit identity. And here again we have God's mercy, and we're called to be companions of Jesus, which of course is another name for Jesuit. But I would argue that what Francis is doing I'm presently revising for the 6th time a piece I'm writing on the Ignatian influence on Francis. What I would argue is that when Francis says we are to encounter Christ and experience his mercy personally in order to turn around and be able to extend that to others, he's actually inviting. First of all, very explicitly, he's inviting everybody to be a missionary disciple. And I would say he's inviting everybody to be a companion of Jesus. And so he's really extending Jesuit identity to all Christians. That maybe Jesuits do it in a community, in an intensive way, but they do not have an exclusive market on being a companion of Jesus. And that's what everybody's being asked for. And then co-workers with God. And so he's saying we pray to enter ever more fully into that great mystical tradition that our first fathers bequeathed to us, ever a grace, ever a challenge. Okay, the first fathers here means the first Jesuits. That's the reference there. And what is this mystical tradition? It's the mystical tradition of the encounter with Jesus. And then he says, we insistently ask for the grace of knowing how we can share in that great ministry of reconciliation. One of my favorite scripture texts is that, we as Corinthians, we are all called to be ministers of reconciliation. So, again, these documents are directed to Jesuits. And so as Jesuits, discernment is their shtick, okay? Whether it's individual discernment or communal discernment. And that is part of the Jesuit identity, and it's a skill that some of the rest of us can learn. And this communal discernment required of the society that they have availability, mobility, humility, freedom, the ability to accompany others, patience, willingness to listen, respectively. Okay, so well, I think I'll leave that there. And the tools for doing this are spiritual conversation and dialogue. I'm delighted to learn that you're practicing the skills of spiritual conversation, because that's, I'm going to be talking about synodal skills in the next presentation, and that's one of them, and dialogue is part of that, and I'll be talking more about that then. And again, the congregation exhorts to closeness to the poor, who challenge us to return constantly to what is essential to the gospel. It wants men on fire with passion for the gospel. The first fathers, meaning the first Jesuits, had experienced the grace that set them free. I'm always talking about covers of books. I talked about The Wounded Healer at the last session. There's John English wrote a book on the spiritual exercises quite a while back called Spiritual Freedom. And that's really the goal of all of this, is to come to personal freedom, which gives us that ability to be mobile, available to accompany others. And so that's an essential goal, spiritual goal. And Pope Francis urges us to pray insistently for this consolation. And I'll talk more about consolation later. So with the theme of reconciliation, this is first and foremost a call to a profound conversion. And the question that is asked in General Congregation 36, which is one the Canadian Jesuits, I've never heard the answer to this yet, but they ask the question, why don't the exercises change us as deeply as we would hope? You know, a Jesuit makes the spiritual exercises in initial formation and then again in tertianship, which comes much later in life. And the goal of the exercises is conversion, is election to follow Christ. And the question is that this should be so deeply formative of the society, that it puts its mark on it. And the question is, why doesn't this happen? And so there's a conviction that God is calling the entire society to a profound spiritual renewal today. And the means to unite, to accomplish this, or to unite the society with God, are the spiritual exercises: daily prayer, Eucharist, sacrament of reconciliation, spiritual direction, and the examen. And what Jesuits tell me is that, of course, the spiritual exercises are foundational, but are experienced twice in life normally, sometimes more. But the examen is probably the central practice here. And I'll leave that to Damien to unpack at some point. Not today. And so the context that we're in is a world losing its sense of God. And so in this context of godlessness in a broader society, we should seek to be more deeply united with Christ. And the exercises are a tool through which we acquire the style of Jesus, his feelings, his choices. So that's why the exercises are so important. So we also have here the transforming encounter with the mercy of God in Christ. And again, I was struck with the use of the word gaze in GC 36. The experience of the merciful gaze of God on our weakness and sinfulness helps us to become compassionate ministers to all. Now, the source of this in the spiritual exercises, since I'm supposed to be unpacking the Jesuit sources here, is the first contemplation in the exercises, where you have the Trinity looking down on a sinful world and deciding that they would send the Son in the incarnation. This very contemplation is explicitly referenced in GC 36 from the exercises. I'm always learning from people. And so I actually learned from Gordon Rickson about the first contemplation. He's my president at Regis. But I had a chance to go to Nairobi and give a talk at Hakima, one of the Jesuit English-speaking theologians. And I stayed in the house of the conference, and there was a regent in there at the time. And he wanted to know what I was doing, so I was telling him I was researching gaze. And he said, and he was the one who told me that in the directions for the exercises, there is an instruction that when the retreatant enters into into prayer, the retreatant is to think of the Lord gazing on him as he enters this prayer period. And so we have two references to gaze in the spiritual exercises, both this preparation for prayer, and this regent told me that's how he begins all his prayer every day, so it was nice to learn this. And secondly, in this first contemplation of the gaze of the Trinity on this sinful world. And so when this is referenced in GC 36, and when it's referenced by Pope Francis, the whole notion is that this isn't only in the spiritual exercises, but today we, whether it's Jesuits or we as collaborators with Jesuits or other Christians, we too gaze on the sinful world and bring a response to it, which is one of mercy. And so, as I said before, filled with the fire of Christ's mercy, we can inflame others And this experience of mercy, again, notice how this is all from GC 36, but it's pure Pope Francis, because the experience of mercy is the source of apostolic audacity. I've never seen it expressed that strongly. And mercy is not an abstraction, but a lifestyle. Okay, a lifestyle is something more than you do once or twice. It's a habitual attitude and way of being. And so it's a lifestyle that consists in concrete gestures rather than mere words. And this comes from Francis's address to GC 36. He gave them a talk, and he's telling them this. So do you see that it's not just in Evangelii Gaudium, or the document on holiness, or an address in a homily, or an address to the Jesuits, but this message of mercy, I would say, is the foundational message of Francis in our time. And he says there is no authentic familiarity with God if we do not allow ourselves to be moved to compassion and action by an encounter with the Christ who is revealed in the suffering, vulnerable faces of people, indeed in the suffering of creation. So when I said that a religious community, one of the things to ask about that community is, what are the scripture images, the scriptural texts which impel that community forward? And I suggested that, I think for Jesuits, I am so on thin ice here, not being a Jesuit, but anyway, when I suggest that I think that the text for Jesuits is the crucifixion, it's not only that Christ was crucified for our sins, but it's also the vision that Christ is crucified in the suffering people. And so the crucifixion, yes, is Christological. It's what happened to Christ on Calvary. But that crucifixion continues in the world today in suffering people. So that when Jesuits are called to reconciliation, when they are called to mercy, when they are called to justice, it's in the face of the suffering people, which is where their work which impels their work for justice and impels their work for mercy. And that's the connection. And so our mission with the reconciler is a reconciliation with God, reconciliation with one another, and reconciliation with creation. And we get that in Laudato Si. Now, in terms of reconciliation with God, Pope Francis says the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of those who encounter with Jesus. With Christ, joy is constantly born anew. And we're going to see that, and this is something I think I develop in the next section, that Francis tells us to pray intensely for the gift of consolation, because we cannot, he says, sourpusses cannot announce the gospel. You have to be a joyful announcer. And so announcing and sharing the gospel continues to be the reason for the society's existence and mission. And then Ignatian spirituality, which informs that mission, facilitates the experience of God and helps the process of personal and communal conversion. And so when I say that discernment is kind of the shtick, the work of the society, the spiritual exercises are the work of the society. Jesuits are known for their work with individuals to develop their interiority, as well as their work for justice. That all of this is to facilitate that experience, which then impels to mission. So the tool for all this is discernment, and that Christian life is more and more personalized through discernment. One of the, in my work with Pope Francis, one of the things that, in which he is very Ignatian, is that he starts with the existential and the concrete, and then he discerns from that. And it's an inductive rather than a deductive approach. It starts at the ground, and he's a dialectical thinker. And so a dialectic is two forms or a tension maybe between an ideal rule and a concrete circumstance, and discernment shows what an individual is capable of doing in advancing on the way of holiness between these two poles. And that is how Christian life is personalized. The other way of using of proceeding would be a deductive approach, which starts with a principle and then applies it to a concrete circumstance. But Walter Kasper has, interestingly, a book on Francis where he describes this as the Jesuit approach, the inductive. So the context of proclaiming the gospel in our time is, of course, a secular society, interreligious dialogue in a pluralistic world, believers who abandon the church in the search for personal meaning and spirituality, and let's face it, who are disillusioned by the church in many cases, and diverse cultural contexts and spiritual traditions. And so we're proclaiming this gospel in this world that is not always ready to receive the message, I guess is what I'd have to say. And so when we move to reconciliation with humanity, it's the promotion of a generous culture of hospitality in the face of hostility to displaced persons. We're seeing that in terms of the movement of migrations today because of war, climate, political violence. It's support of marginalized peoples by the defense and promotion of human rights in integral ecology. Integral ecology is a category that comes out of Laudato Si, which talks about the interrelationship of humans and creation. And then to contribute to peace locally and globally in the face of fundamentalism, intolerance, and ethnic, religious, political conflicts that are a source of conflict, violence, and polarization. And we're seeing polarization in our society more than we ever have in our political discourse. And this polarization is finding its way into the church. And we see this nationally here in the United States pretty seriously. And so the task of reconciliation is not just to live in our silos of those who think like us, which is always more comfortable, but how to engage that with others. I was talking to my own community recently, and one of the things, I don't know if they're going to do this, I go home and I talk about things Ignatian, and they say, but we're Vincentian. But anyway, is that, so we are a community of 159 people right now. Most of them, of course, as with most religious women's communities, are retired and well up in age. And so I think there is something we can still do, and that is, and I said this, and I don't know if they'll implement it, is that I think one of the things we can do is to bring people who experience differences together for dialogue, and to be a place for that dialogue, to facilitate that dialogue. And that kind of an effort doesn't take a lot of money. It just takes people coming together and having the skills of dialogue, and that would promote this reconciliation. At least that's my opinion. And then finally, reconciliation with creation. Pope Francis in Laudato Si points out the fundamental connection between the environmental crisis and today's social crisis, that poverty, social exclusion, and marginalization are linked with environmental degradation. And we see movements and migration of peoples largely for reasons of climate, which sometimes have human sources. In terms of a renewal of apostolic life, he calls for a deeper understanding of the mystery of evil in the world and the transforming power of the merciful gaze of God. There we go again, gaze. Who labors to create one reconciled, peaceful family. This semester I taught 2 courses. One was ecclesiology, one was priestly people, lay and ordained. I teach the priesthood course at Regis. And so I had 3 scholastics in the course. And so I love asking, it's not, I'm not going to tell you who you are, but you have to tell me who you are. And I said, what is your charism? And they had to think. And one was from Haiti, one was from Zambia, and the other one was from the United States. And so one of them finally said, well, I think our charism is to discern the work of God in the world. That's not bad. That wasn't bad. And this idea of God who labors to create. God is already laboring in the world. And so this guy was telling me, our job is to be alert to find that. And then a depth of interiority and reflection that allows us to understand reality more deeply and to serve more effectively and to confront obstacles to reconciliation, propose solutions, and then networking and collaboration. And that's where the rest of us come in. So discernment, this goes back to what my Jesuit scholastic was telling me, begins in contemplation of God at work in our world and serves as foundation for decision making. And shared discernment leads to shared vision. And forming collaborators for mission, that's us, means that we are formed for discernment. And so, Damien, you get to form us for discernment. So, in his address to GC 36, Francis had 3 parts to this address. He said to ask intensely for consolation, to allow ourselves to be moved by our Lord on the cross, here's the cross again, and do good with a good spirit by thinking with the church. Okay, to break this down, consolation. He says the task of the society is to console the Christian faithful and to help them in their discernment so that the enemy of human nature does not distract us from joy. So he says, you've got to pray for consolation really hard. It's not selfish. You can't do your job without it. And he says the service of joy and spiritual consolation is rooted in prayer, and that joy is constitutive of the gospel. We've had justice being constitutive of the gospel, but now he's saying joy is consistent. One cannot deliver good news with a sullen face. Joy is an indicator of grace, and it's an indicator that love is active, operative, and present. How can you argue with that? I mean, we're told to go be joyful. And, joy is at work in the discernment of spirit in terms of the discernment of consolation versus desolation. And in the autobiography of Ignatius, one of the things he learned about when he was learning about discernment through his own experiences is he had to distinguish between joys that endured, that stayed, and joys that were fleeting. And he found out that, the joys that endured were leading him towards the good spirits. He says, this joy of an explicit proclamation of the gospel by means of preaching in the faith and the practice of justice and mercy is what drives the society out to the margins of society. Now, this is where we have a connection between the Jesuits and the joy of the gospel by Francis, because, again, if you recall, mobility was one of the characteristics of the society that enabled them to go to the margins of society. And in the joy of the gospel, Francis is telling us to go to the peripheries. And here he's saying that joy is what enables that to happen. Now, okay, I've worked with Jesuits for 18 years now, and none of us are joyful all the time. So let's just acknowledge that. And not every individual is joyful most of the time. One of the questions or the challenges that Francis is asking us to do is to reignite this joy. And he says of himself that he received the gift of joy and it's never left him. Gee, that would be terrific, wouldn't it? Huh?
I would like that.
I would like that. Yeah, I would like that. But here he's saying that the spiritual exercises are the apostolic method par excellence, insofar as they make possible a return to the heart, to the principle of docility to the spirit, and who awakens, encourages whoever undertakes the exercises to personal fidelity to God. So there's a connection here with consolation. So to talk about the cross again, he says, to allow ourselves to be moved by the Lord on the cross, both in his person and his present in the sufferings of so many of our brothers and sisters. And that mercy is not an abstraction but a lifestyle. I've already talked about that. But again, the connection between Jesus on the cross and the suffering of the world. So the Lord looks upon us with mercy and chooses us, sends us forth with the same powerful mercy to the poor, the sinners, the abandoned, the crucified, and anyone who suffers from injustice and violence in today's world. And then only when we experience this in our own lives, in our own wounds. And notice he says here, wounds that have first and last names. This, in other words, you know who's wounded you. They have a name, And so this is not abstract. This is real. As individuals and as a body, will we be able to lose our fear of allowing ourselves to be moved by the immense suffering of brothers and sisters. And he says, as we walk with them, we learn from them how best to help and serve them. So this is not paternalistic. It's not deductive. In other words, we don't determine in advance how to best help someone. We only know how to help someone if we walk with them and we learn from them what they need rather than telling them. Peter Faber is an early Jesuit. He says, in many cases, those wanted to reform the church were right, but God did not wish to correct the church using their methods. We could probably put a lot of names on that one. And so thinking with the church involves carrying the cross, walking with and serving a humiliated church, and that we need to work against an anti-ecclesial spirit, which we see a lot of today, especially with the abuse crisis. Okay, this is what he says in his address to GC 36, but elsewhere, Francis also talks about thinking with the church. And for Francis to think with the church is to think with the people, to hear the people, because it would be a mistake to equate the church simply with the hierarchical church, with its leaders. But to think with the church means to be in touch with it, which will be important when we talk about synodality. Okay, that's Jesuit mission.
Wow.
So how do we sum that up? I mean, it's mission for reconciliation, it's mission for mercy, it's mission that's related to the cross, it's mission that goes to the peripheries. That would be my summation of all that.
Thank you.
Okay, this is shorter and more open-ended. And in fact, this Unit 3 is a little misleading because it only has 4 slides, and then I'm going to jump to something else, and I'll show you what I'm doing. So, as a participant in the Church's apostolic mission, an Ignatian leader is a man or woman for and with others who has a global perspective that is who has a perspective that is both local and global, who engages under the standard of the cross in the crucial struggle of our time, the struggle for faith and that struggle for justice, which it includes. As a director of work, a school leader is a public minister of the church. That came from Damien. Notice the themes that we're seeing here. Again, the cross, struggle of our time, faith, justice. So some of those themes come around. So the goals for this unit were to better understand Ignatian leadership as a vocation that further advances the church's apostolic mission, to live the gospel and proclaim the reign of God, and to be familiar with documents. Basically, as I thought about this, I think formation for Ignatian leadership has 3 dimensions. The first is spiritual, which would include personal interiority. I'm not presupposing that everybody is a Catholic, and certainly most of us are not Jesuits, but all of us, whatever our faith orientation, is called to personal interiority. Damien is here to enhance this aspect of formation here at McQuaid through the spiritual exercises, discernment, spiritual direction, and so on and so forth. But I think I've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to belabor it. The second, I think, is that there's an intellectual formation that's required. And one is that even if a person is not Catholic, I think to work in a Catholic institution, there should be some familiarity and knowledge of the Catholic faith. I taught ecclesiology this last semester, and I had a Mennonite student from another college in my class. And on the first day of class, I looked at him. He was just a wonderful individual. I said, "This is going to be very Roman Catholic. I'm just warning you." And he said, "That's why I'm here." And because he wanted to learn, and many people from other faiths want to know about Catholicism if they're engaged in ecumenical dialogue with us, or they're working in our institutions, or whatever. And so I think it's always good to have that knowledge. I'm involved with dialogue with Orthodox Baptists and Lutherans, and I always value having, I know the Lutherans the best, And I always value having a colleague that I can have that kind of conversation with. Then I think, from what I've said this morning, cultural intelligence is really important. That if the society goes to the peripheries, goes into the world to engage in works of reconciliation, works of justice, works of mercy, you have to know the world. You have to know the culture, whether it's our own culture or other cultures. And so there's a cultural intelligence that's required in a global society today that I don't think we can underestimate. And then thirdly, on the professional level, I think I've tipped in this direction in the previous presentations where I talked about tools, that there are basic tools that come along with the Jesuit Ignatian tradition that help us. And one of these for our time is dialogue. And I have a more extended presentation on that, but I don't know if we'll have time for it. Paul VI came out with a document, Ecclesiam Suam, which means his church, in 1964. And because that was just in the midst of the Second Vatican Council, which ended in 1965, it didn't get a lot of attention at that time. But this document by Paul VI is mostly about dialogue. And that in a multicultural, global, interreligious, ecumenical environment, the important thing is to engage in dialogue, which is more than an exchange of information, but an exchange of our person with another person. In ecumenism, and dialogue is kind of the coin of the realm for ecumenism. The thing is that in dialogue, you should be able to know and represent another person's position as well as they can, or even better, to get inside that. And the decree on ecumenism says that what's important for people to know is the animus that motivates the dialogue partner. Okay, animus is a Latin word which means spirit, or that which animates, really, the other person. And so it's really to get inside their skin and to know what makes them tick, and to be able to see the world through their lens. And that is the goal of dialogue. And that's the kind of dialogue we need with people with political differences, with religious differences, ideological differences of various kinds. And I have to admit that sometimes I give myself a little talk and say, Susan, okay, you're an ecumenist. Why don't you practice this more in your classroom? Because students still have the ability to hit my hot buttons, unfortunately. And I don't always do that. So this is a story. I was teaching at Marquette. It was an undergrad class, and I let this kid get to me. And he hit my ecumenical button, which was, ecumenism is just lowest common denominator of Catholicism. Well, I got mad, and the problem was I let him see it. And you should never do that in the classroom, and that was not one of my prouder moments. I get a student in class who's ideologically different than myself. And, the whole question is, how do I respect this person and disagree at the same time? Especially when some students interpret disagreement as disrespect, when those are two different things. So anyway, I'm still working on it, and I suspect we all are. Okay, the second tool is spiritual conversation. I have information on this. I don't have to give it to you because you've been doing it all day. And I've been told this is one of the success stories of whatever the society is for Jesuit high schools. JSN, that is one of their success stories, that and the Universal Apostolic Preferences. So I don't have to go there. But the third, I'm told, that you might find some things helpful, and that is to engage and implement synodal processes in your schools or in your committees or in wherever you have influence. As you all know, the World Church is engaged in a process for a worldwide synod, which was postponed from October 2023 to now 2024 to give more time. I'm also here to tell you that North America is one of the worst places on the globe for implementing this process. The bishops, by and large, have not been really behind it to any great extent. There is a website attached to the Vatican website on the Synod, so if you want to read about it, the documents that are there are a preparatory document. The themes are participation, communion, and mission. There's a document on the spirituality of synodality, and now the continental reports are in, and the North American Continental Report is among them. In terms of the North American Continental Report, I mean, it doesn't look too bad, but the process of arriving at it was not good, in that for the final process, bishops picked 3 or 4 people from their diocese to represent their diocese. And that is not an inclusive voice process. But at any rate, the documents are there if you want to see them. Now, what I want to do, and I have to change track here, if I can do this. No, that's not the one I want. I've got one that's pretty. So the word synod literally means walking together, and so it's walking together as church. So there's this worldwide synod, which is an event that has been in an extensive preparation, and as I just said, the synod itself will take place in fall of 2024. For the very first time, I just saw this past week, that the Pope actually determines who attends it, and he's determined that the lay people attending this will actually have voting power at this for a difference. Up until last week, there was one woman who had voting, who was Nathalie Bécard, who is a Xavier sister from France, who's been the undersecretary for the process of the synod. And from the very beginning, she had voting power because of her position in the dicastery. She's a very impressive woman. So Francis is expanding this. Now, what has been happening with synods is Paul VI actually implemented the structure in the church, but it was very artificial in that bishops could sign up to say something with a limit of 3 minutes, and there was just a rota. And so, one person talking was not answering to the person who talked before. And so, I mean, that's not a conversation. That's not even walking together. And so, successively, the popes have tried to loosen up the process and make it more practical. And so, it can be more of a conversation now. But what I want to say is that synodality is a kind of an introduction to a new vision of church. And so it's really a synodal church, whether or not a worldwide synod ever happens. And frankly, I think this is great. but at another level, I don't care that much. I hate to say this out loud, because I think the process is more important than the event. And so the synod itself is a name applied to ecclesial assemblies convoked at various levels. You can have a diocesan synod or provincial synod, regional, patriarchal, like Patriarch of the West, Patriarch of the East, or a universal synod. The one coming up is a universal synod. But you know, the Synod of Baltimore is what gave us the Baltimore Catechism way back before Vatican II. So, you know, but they kind of synods fell out of use, and at various levels it's to put them together. And so it would be really nice for parishes to have synods, dioceses to have synods, and to implement this at kind of a grassroots level. And according to this, to walk together is a constitutive way of the church. And it's a figure of speech that enables us to interpret reality with the heart, eyes and heart of God. And it's a condition for following the Lord and being servants of life in this wounded time. So it's the process, again, that we're talking about. And it's a way of living in the church's ordinary way of living and working. And it fosters and develops the participation and collaboration of everybody together. Now, it's a method of, or a way of being church that serves as a correction. You know, the old adage was that the role of the laity was to pay, pray, and obey. This changed with Vatican II, when the apostolate of the laity was identified as something that is properly theirs by virtue of baptism and confirmation, and is not simply a participation in the apostolate of the ordained. But nevertheless, in the church, too often the laity have been passive. And the move in the synodal way is to move towards the participation of all. So just as today, probably just as important or more important than anything I've said to you are your table conversations, because your table conversations are where you're participating in the process. It's a correction to clericalism, where power, authority, influence, prestige, status, voice, you know, make the list as long as you want, is replaced by the common dignity of people of God ordered within an ordered communion. This is not total democracy. I'm an ecclesiologist, and I say that the principles of good liturgical celebration are the principles by which the ecclesial life should be ordered. So the principle of liturgical renewal is the full, active, conscious participation of everyone in the liturgy. That translates into full, active, conscious participation of people in ecclesial life. That is not a democratic principle, it's a liturgical principle. And democratic just means every person gets a vote. This is not about voting. It's about being engaged and being responsible. This goes back to Francis's emphasis on everybody being a missionary disciple. He's saying it's not just the clergy who are supposed to do everything, but look how he's multiplying the power of the church by putting the responsibility on everyone's shoulders, not just clergy. You know, he's just exponentially increased the proclamation of the gospel by doing that. It's also a correction of individualism, which our culture is full of it, to an emphasis on communion, that we are interconnected, and solidarity. And then it's, again, a correction from a view of the church in terms of self-preservation to mission. So these are big goals for this way of thinking and being. Additional corrections is, to correct the concentration of responsibility for mission in the persons of pastors, insufficient appreciation of consecrated life and charismatic gifts. Pope Francis is a Jesuit. always is bringing up religious communities and trying to raise them up to visibility in a time where maybe they're not as visible as they were at one point. And then charismatic gifts, which are given to all the faithful in baptism and confirmation. And it's a correction to rarely making use of the specific and qualified contribution of the lay faithful, including women, in their area of expertise. The goal of synodality is to increase missionary energy. And so Vatican II tells us that the whole faithful together have a sense of the faith. And all members of the church are agents of evangelization. And ecumenically, it's an invitation to walk together on the path towards full communion of Christian churches. Ecumenism was one of the goals for which Vatican II was convened in the first time, and that's frequently kind of forgotten. The theological foundations of synodality are the Trinity is a model of this, of how you can have unity and still have diversity. Church's communion, church's pilgrim, which is chapter 7 of the Dogmatic Constitution on the Church. But I think most especially baptismal ecclesiology, because in baptism we receive the gifts of the Spirit, and everyone is equal in dignity. And it's that equality in dignity that we're called for. Now, in this call to conversion, we don't have a path that's marked out for everybody in advance. That's where discernment comes in, and everybody is individual in how they live this out. And it requires us to be open to the unexpected from God, who moves us interiorly through listening to others. Natalie Baker says that through spiritual conversations, like you have experienced at this meeting, we should expect ourselves to be transformed through that experience and grow in conversion. And because part of that is listening to one another, being challenged by one another, having our worlds expanded by one another in that conversation. And so what's also happening is that discernment, which we used to think of as an individual thing, that we individually discern what I should do with my life or what I should do next, that what's happening is there's an emphasis now on communal discernment. The Jesuits of Canada, I really am an advertisement for them, I guess. But at any rate, if you check their website, you will find a toolkit for communal discernment that they have developed. It has a wonderful presentation of how to go about a spiritual conversation. So if you are trying to duplicate a little bit what you're experiencing here, that gives you the instructions for how to go about it. And then it takes it a step further in terms of there would be a third round of conversation where you discern. And discernment would mean attending to the experience of consolation and desolation of the group as they experience that. That still is not yet coming to a discernment about a decision, but is a discernment of the interior movements of the group that's engaged in conversation. So anyway, that's kind of the next step where discernment is going. I would like to caution us that discernment is not a cookie cutter and is not a recipe. So, you don't go through steps A, B, C, D, and E and you come out with G. But discernment is really a growth in the spiritual life, a growth in interiority. And I'm not sure we've made that jump as we move to communal discernment. I think that's still ahead of us. And the aim is to produce a missionary communion in service of the world. And it's a spiritual process. Conversion doesn't happen all at once. I remember I went to Rome once and I said, I need a conversion. And they said, why would you go to Rome for that? Okay, and it's so, and synodality is rooted in ecclesiology of the people of God. It's everybody's equal dignity, called to be a missionary disciple, and taking the sense of the faith seriously in individuals. An example of communal discernment was the Council of Jerusalem. We have two accounts of this in Scripture. One is in Acts 15, 4-29. The other one is in the Epistle to the Galatians. And the matter being discerned communally at that point was what to do with Gentiles wanting to convert to the Christian movement, which up to that point had been a Jewish Christian movement. Would they be required to keep the dietary laws and be circumcised? And so we have an account of that actually in the Scriptures. Now, there's this distinction in the church made between deliberative and consultative voice. Deliberative voice means you can actually have a vote and you make a decision. A consultative voice means that you get to your voice to be heard, and then there's the decision maker other than you who makes the final decision. And so in the church, by canon law, in a parish, the pastor has the final word. And in fact, it's very difficult, according to canon law, to remove a pastor from a parish. And so you have pastors, parish, bishops, and pope have deliberative voices. Everyone else has a consultative voice, unless the pope says that in such and such a synod, people who are members may have a deliberative voice. And that's what Francis has done for the synod coming up. So we're still living in a hierarchical church. And so the synodal process takes place within that hierarchically structured community. And so we need to distinguish between decision-making and decision-taking. Making means that a group comes up with maybe a solution or a position or whatever it is, but then that needs to be confirmed by the person who has the authority to actually take the decision. And this is this is a sticking point, to use my 3 points. This is a sticking point in some areas of the world and with some people who think that the synodal process should all be deliberative and not consultative. And one example of this is what's happening with the synodal way in Germany right now. They want deliberative rather than consultative voice. I'm going to skip that. So Nathalie Bécard says that synodality lived in a profound attitude of listening to the Spirit is a path of personal and community conversion. It moves from I to we. It includes all people who participate, and then you have some, the College of Bishops, and then the one. So there's a reciprocal relationship between the faithful, the bishops, and the communion of churches. I'm rushing through these because I'm out of time. And so there's levels of synodality, either the particular church, which is a theological term which basically translates into the diocese administratively. So within the diocese, you can have a diocesan synod, a presbyteral council, a college of consultors, or a pastoral council. And you can have it at the level of provinces or at the level of the universal church. And at any level, your decision taker, like the Pope, is not above the church, but within it as one of the baptized. The bishop is not just above the diocese, but within the diocese as a member of the church, and the same way as a pastor with his parish. So this means the person with leadership has to be embedded in the community. This goes back to St. Augustine. All of us receive a sacramental character of baptism and confirmation. And then ordained deacons, presbyters, and bishops have a sacramental character of ordination. But, their baptismal character doesn't fall out just when they get another one. And so Augustine said, what I am with you as a baptized person consoles me. What I am for you as an ordained person terrifies me. It's kind of a reflection of that. And so what this results in is a kind of collaborative leadership, which is no longer exclusively vertical and clerical, but more horizontal and cooperative. It's kind of a servant leadership. Business corporations have adopted servant leadership. There are corporate conferences given on this, so it's not just a church thing. And it's a way of accompanying by placing oneself in the midst of others, a service of freedom, being with others in co-responsibility that seeks the empowerment of all. And the formation for synodality includes listening skills, dialogical skills, and communal discernment skills. And I already told you what this timeline is. And so anyway, that's the information on synodality. And I think what I would like to see is, and the reason I presented it to you as part of leadership in a Catholic school, is that in addition to engaging in the spiritual conversations, which I am being told that you are wonderful at, is that to incorporate the principles and spirit behind synodality in faculty meetings, in committee meetings, in terms of listening, hearing all the voices, coming to discernment. And it's when we can practice this, and I think it's practiced best from the ground roots up, which is one of the reasons the Worldwide Synod is running into challenges. Then we will be a synodal church, and we will achieve that goal of missionary discipleship for everyone. Thank you.
Wow. So while that looks like a really heavy lift, I just want you to know that I asked Susan to really focus on synodality simply because we have been doing it and we may not have been aware of it. So those of us who have been around when we did our self-study for our sponsorship review, remember that was all about communal discernment. That was about dialogue. That was about listening. And the steering committee did not do statistics. They listened. And for those of us who were present in this room at this very same event last year, it's exactly what we did. And it was painful, but it was honest and it is real. And it has taken us to a very different place. So this notion of synodality, of moving together as a community, is central to who we are as McCoy Jesuit. It is central to who we are as JSM. It is central to the communion that we share with our Jesuit brothers and Ignatian spirituality. So Susan really put some theological and ecclesiological language around something that is part and parcel of how we now comport ourselves. And so I want to congratulate you, and I want to congratulate you too, Susan, for putting all of that together for us.